Hey, this is gonna be kind of a weird video, so before we begin, take a look at this barn. Nice. Here's some more pictures. Really take it in. You got it? Cool. Let's get going. A few months ago, I went on vacation to Paris and saw this painting. One thing that immediately sticks out about it, which I think that most people know, is that the Mona Lisa is small. Just 77 by 53 centimeters, or 30 by 21 inches. This is especially noticeable against the otherwise empty wall that it's hung on. Even more so when it's compared to every other painting in the room. Every wall is filled with massive paintings that I think can literally be described as epic. This is especially true for the wall opposite the Mona Lisa, which is completely covered by Paolo Veronese's The Wedding at Cana. Just over 22 feet high and 32.5 across. Looking at it from across the room, the crowd of people almost seemed to bleed into the painting and spill out from it. And speaking of the crowd, around 10 million people visit the Louvre every year, and of them, an estimated 80% are there just to see one painting. There's a line to see it that, when I went, began near the entrance of the room and wound its way through those rope barriers, which I just learned are called stanchions. Once you get to the front, there's a little area where the line breaks down and you have to kind of push your way to the front, almost like you're at a concert. This is pretty unsurprisingly an extremely common complaint. If you look through the one-star reviews of the Louvre on Google, most of the complaints are from people upset by how much of a circus seeing the Mona Lisa is.
Seeing the La Gioconda should be a mystical, very special moment, but unfortunately, it was like being at the fish market. Extremely busy and noisy, people giggling and taking stupid selfies, not even looking properly at the painting and totally ignoring the charm and the magic. Very sad experience. The management should review the whole process. Small room, tiny groups of 15 to 20 people, allowed to admire the masterpiece for a few minutes in peace and awe. Please think about it.
You travel all the way to look at the world-famous Mona Lisa, and when you finally get there, you're treated like cattle and allowed to take only one picture and explicitly not to look at the painting. When a selfie is more important than art itself, the Louvre has failed as a museum.
Pickpockets at the entrance of the Louvre Museum. Zero police. Security of the museum didn't care. We fell victim to this scum. Bad overall experience. We'll never visit Paris again. Cannot recommend this place, especially for tourists.
Sorry, a bunch of them are also just people being super racist towards Roma people. Imagine how big of a piece of shit you have to be if France isn't racist enough for you. Dude should really give Paris another chance. Just look into what they did in Haiti. So first of all, that second one is really funny because I have no idea who told them that they couldn't take multiple pictures or look at the painting, but that's absolutely not a rule. But maybe this is a bit of a hot take. When that first reviewer says how seeing it should be this magical and transformative experience, but it's ruined because these people are talking and taking selfies, I have to wonder, was that really the issue? Don't get me wrong, it is obviously a good painting, and seeing it was genuinely impactful to me. I mean, look at the length of this video. But I have to admit that I didn't appreciate the Mona Lisa in the same way that I did any of the other paintings in that room. In fact, I don't know if I even appreciate it in the same way as I do any other painting, period. Not because it's so perfect, but because the Mona Lisa is so ubiquitous that, for me, it doesn't really register as art at all. If I went to someone's house and they had a framed print of the Mona Lisa on their wall, my first thought wouldn't be that they must be really into Renaissance paintings. It'd be to wonder why they didn't take out the piece of paper that comes with the frame. And I just feel like a print of the Mona Lisa is one step below. This is kind of a deep cut, but have you ever seen this store called I Maisie? So they're a German company with locations all over the world, and what they do is you go into this store and pay them to take a picture of your iris, and then they make it into a print. I am deeply obsessed with this company, mostly just because I think it'd be really funny to get a bunch of prints of my eye and then give them away as gifts. Just for any occasion too. Like, obviously birthdays and holidays are a no-brainer, but I think they'd work just as well for things like weddings, bar bat mitzvahs, or baby showers too. Just giving people a picture of my eye to put in a nursery, like, don't worry, I tested it. It works. Sorry, I don't want to get distracted talking about iMaisie. You know those videos where they'll layer a bunch of voices on top of each other and are like, this is what it's like to have ADHD. No, this video is what it's like. Welcome to We're in Hell, the channel where I turn my hyperfixations into your problem. I think I might make it a Patreon goal though, where like if I hit a certain amount, I'll make a full video about iMaisie. Comment if you think I should do that. But the point is that maybe this makes me bad at liking art, but I feel like at this point the Mona Lisa is so saturated that it has the same level of meaningfulness as an eye picture. And so to me, seeing it felt less like some magical experience of aesthetic bliss and more like that feeling of recognition you get seeing a celebrity walking down the street. Like, I'm not gonna call the Mona Lisa bad, but I will say that if it's your favorite painting, that's incredibly weird. And I'm not saying that because I'm just making up a weirdo with a house filled with Mona Lisa posters, all of whose lips are noticeably worn out. For this video, I've read so many things by people who are obsessed with this painting, and they're all freaks. Legit, going all the way back to probably the first person to make the Mona Lisa famous, an English art critic named Walter Pater, who in 1873 published a book called The Renaissance: Studies in Art and Poetry. The book was a collection of essays he'd written, each discussing a different Renaissance painter, and the most famous of these was his one on Leonardo da Vinci, in which he describes the Mona Lisa like this.
La Gioconda is, in the truest sense, Leonardo's masterpiece, the revealing instance of his mode of thought and work. From childhood, we see this image defining itself on the fabric of his dreams, and, but for express historical testimony, we might fancy that this was but his ideal lady, embodied and beheld at last. The presence that thus rose so strangely beside the waters is expressive of what in the ways of 1,000 years men had come to desire. Hers is the head upon which all the ends of the world are. Set it for a moment beside one of those white Greek goddesses or beautiful women of antiquity, and how would they be troubled by this beauty? She is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave. And as Leda was the mother of Helen of Troy, and as Saint Anne, yes, the mother of Mary, certainly Lady Lisa might stand as the embodiment of the old fancy, the symbol of the modern idea.
So first of all, what the fuck? Secondly, Pater's book was a massive hit, often credited with reigniting the English-speaking world's interest in Renaissance art. But more than that, his essay on Da Vinci was what led to the Mona Lisa becoming not just famous in the art world, but coming to be seen as the quintessential capital M masterpiece. But coming back to those angry reviews, I don't think that they're wrong in terms of how they describe the experience, and while I wouldn't say that I share their frustration, I do agree that there is something strange about the crowds. Well, I know I've been kind of hard on it, and do think that the Mona Lisa is the most overrated painting in the world. Maybe it's just the hype, but even still, it is genuinely pretty cool to see it in a way that's not really captured in a print or on a screen. But a lot of the people I saw there, especially the ones most eager to get to the front, did mostly just see it through a screen. And that's a bit ironic, right? Like, the Mona Lisa is literally the easiest painting in the world to find a picture of, so what's the point of photographing it? And let me just say that while I think this is going to get pretty interesting, I am well aware that people these days use their phones too much is kind of a Banksy tier observation, and I'm absolutely not the first to make it. In fact, the footage that I've been showing is from a project that explores exactly this question. The horrendously named #Mona Lisa is an experimental film that was shot in the Louvre and consists entirely of slow motion footage of people looking at the Mona Lisa. It's also 11 hours long and was shot in 360p. In an interview, Jennifer Anderson, the film's co-director, said this about the length.
Initially, #Mona Lisa was going to be a short, possibly 1 10-minute shot that we intended to submit to the New York Times OpDoc series. However, we realized that a short wasn't going to work. Any editorial decisions we made would ultimately reduce a complex subject into an overly simplistic argument. So we allowed the content to dictate the form, which resulted in an 11-hour film.
Yeah, totally. That's why my videos are the length they are too. It's not that I'm an undisciplined writer, I'm just letting the content dictate the form. I honestly think, though, that the makers of this film do correctly identify how there is something very strange about the way that the Mona Lisa is famous. And I know where you think this is going. I promise you this isn't going to be a video about how we need to stop staring at our phones and experience the world around us or some bullshit like that. In fact, where I disagree with those angry comments is that I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with people looking at the Mona Lisa like this. Instead, I would argue that the people taking selfies are actually the ones experiencing the painting, if not correctly, then at least as it's now meant to be enjoyed. In this video, we're going to talk about why it is that people photograph the most photographed painting in the world. Unlike Pater, when I saw the Mona Lisa, the thing I thought about wasn't how she's a vampire goddess. Instead, I was reminded of a much more recent piece of art, the book White Noise by Don DeLillo. In one scene, which was very frustratingly cut out of the recent movie adaptation on Netflix, so I couldn't use clips of it for this video, the main character, a college professor named Jack Gladney, takes his friend and colleague Murray J. Siskin to a local tourist attraction called the most photographed barn in America. We drove 22 miles into the country around Farmington. There were meadows and apple orchards. White fences trailed through the rolling fields. Soon the signs started appearing. The most photographed barn in America. We counted 5 signs before we reached the site. There were 40 cars and a tour bus in the makeshift parking lot. We walked along a cow path to the slightly elevated spot set aside for viewing and photographing. All the people had cameras. Some had tripods, telephoto lenses, filter kits. A man in a booth sold postcards and slides, pictures of the barn taken from the elevated spot. We stood near a grove of trees and watched the photographers. Murray maintained a prolonged silence, occasionally scrawling some notes in a little book. "No one sees the barn," he said finally. A long silence followed. "Once you've seen the signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn." He fell silent once more. People with cameras left the elevated site, replaced at once by others. "We're not here to capture an image. We're here to maintain one. Every photograph reinforces the aura. Can you feel it, Jack? An accumulation of nameless energies." There was an extended silence. The man in the booth sold postcards and slides. "Being here is a kind of spiritual surrender. We see only what the others see. The thousands who were here in the past, those who will come in the future. We've agreed to be part of a collective perception. This literally colors our vision, a religious experience in a way, like all tourism." Another silence ensued. "They are taking pictures of taking pictures," he said. He did not speak for a while. We listened to the incessant clicking of shutter release buttons, the rustling crank of levers that advanced the film. "What was the barn like before it was photographed?" he said. "What did it look like? How was it different from other barns? How was it similar to other barns? We can't answer these questions because we've read the signs, seen the people snapping the pictures. We can't get outside the aura. We're part of the aura. We're here. We're now." he seemed immensely pleased by this. So first of all, I can't stress enough how much I love this book and think you should absolutely read it. It is very much postmodern fiction, and so maybe avoid it if you don't have patience for books where you hear descriptions like, her skin was as soft as bamboo lyocell. Her bright eyes shined up at him like Advil liquid gels. But if you don't mind that, and I am exaggerating a bit here, this book is so good. Really funny and pretentious in all the most fun ways. But yeah, that section of the book has been jokingly referred to as the most talked about scene in postmodern fiction, and it's for good reason. Not only because it slaps, but because it puts into words exactly what's so strange about something that's famous for being famous. I think for me, it perfectly encapsulates the experience of seeing the Mona Lisa. People are taking pictures of taking pictures. Everything in that room, including the people in it, are there in service of maintaining this aura that the painting has because of its notoriety. With that said, I want to dig deeper into what this really means, what's really happening here. And so, one good place to start is by asking if this is necessarily a bad thing. While white noise is overall extremely critical of contemporary society and the postmodern condition, DeLillo doesn't really give a particularly clear answer to this question. The fact that Jack remains silent while his smug media theorist colleague says all this implies to me that the scene isn't just meant as a critique of the barn or the people taking pictures, but also of people like Murray and now me. That said, Don DeLillo may have 2 Pulitzers, but his YouTube channel fucking sucks, so screw him. I think it's an interesting question. So to answer this, something you need to know about white noise is that it is an extremely transparent novelization of Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. I'll just give everyone who I convinced to buy a copy a minute here to cancel their orders. This scene in particular does a perfect job of explaining the concept of a simulacrum as Baudrillard understood it. Simulacra are signs or symbols that don't point to anything. The barn, which is never actually described, is an amazing example of this. It's a tourist attraction for being a tourist attraction. It's photographed because it's been photographed. This also means that, in a sense, it has no origin. No one goes to see what the barn is, but what it's become. You can only photograph the most photographed barn after it's already been photographed. But while I was at the Louvre, something else that really struck me was this video's sponsor, PayPal Honey. This is by far the most disrespectful and evil thing I've ever done. Honey is an online shopping tool that automatically searches for promo codes on lots of your favorite websites. I've been trying to get into better shape lately, something which we all know can only be done by first getting an inexplicably expensive exercise shirt. But with Honey, I've been able to save on lots of these purchases. And best of all, it's completely free to use. Just go to joinhoney.com/we'reinhell, all one word, no apostrophe. If you think that's impressive, check this out. Honey has over 100,000 5-star reviews. So click the link in the description to get Honey today. Just thought I'd take a little trip out to the garden. Welcome. This is my overgrown bamboo plant. So while Baudrillard saw society coming to be dominated by simulacra as a problem, there is a barn half full perspective as well. In a paper by David Allen and Agatha Handley called The Most Photographed Barn in America, Simulacra of the Sublime in American Art and Photography, they argue that the barn being a simulacrum is good, actually. Their argument is one that I really jive with in a lot of ways. It's based on a Neoplatonist perspective. So, Plato's most famous work is The Republic, where he talks about a cool prank where a bunch of people are trapped in a cave and can only watch shadows on the wall. When one guy gets out and sees the real world for the first time, he's given a cash prize or something. It's been a while since I've read it, but I watched Mr. Beast's recreation of it, so I think I get the gist. Plato then outlines his ideal society, where the philosopher kings are at the top since they can reveal the truth of the world of forms. Although convenient that he gives himself the best job, eh? One of the aspects of Plato's Republic that's a sticking point for a lot of people is his stance on art. Plato thought that art was bad since it led people to believe in illusions and away from the truth, and so he thought it should largely be banned. But after his death, new philosophers started to continue his theories. One of these guys was Plotinus, who's largely seen as the founder of Neoplatonism, which kind of funny considering how, even though he was born just over 150 years after Plato's death, it feels a bit soon to start pulling out the Neo prefix, considering that we're still dealing with guys where the only pictures we have of them are of marble sculptures. Plotinus pointed out that art might actually not be bad, and in fact might even be good. He argued that just like philosophers, artists can help people see the forms too. But let's come back to the most photographed barn in America. In White Noise, Murray says that once people have seen the signs, they can't see the barn for what it actually is. The thing is, though, that the most photographed barn in America is a real place, and as you may have guessed, you have seen it. So, this is the T.A. Moulton Barn, built by Thomas Alma Moulton and his sons between 1912 and 1945. It's since become a tourist attraction to photograph the barn with the Teton Mountain Range in the background, often seen as a symbol of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And honestly, if you're from a place called Jackson Hole, I understand why you'd want people to talk about anything aside from your hilarious town name. While it's not generally referred to as the most photographed barn in America, it is accurate to call it that, and it's not unlikely that this is what Don DeLillo was referencing in the book. This particular picture was taken by J. Riley Stewart in 2015, but this isn't quite what it actually looks like, though. In a blog post, Stewart explains how he took this original image and altered it, first by cropping the sides, then by lightening and warming the barn to emphasize that it's the subject of the picture, as well as doing the same to the mountains to make them look more dramatic. The reason he did all this is because, for Stewart,
good photographs tell a clear and compelling story. And just like a literary story, the photograph must have a leading character, a subject certainly, but it must also place that subject in context with other elements of the story, in order to evoke an emotional response. Not everyone will see the same story as the photographer, but this is true. If the artist tells a good story, it's much easier for someone else to emotionally engage in the scene and dream up their own setting, plot, or ending. And that's what good art is all about.
The story that Stewart was trying to tell here was one about man versus nature and the hardships faced by the people who tried to settle this land, dating back to the Pilgrims. Stewart writes about how, when he visited the barn, he experienced a sense of the sublimity of nature, and that his goal in telling this story wasn't necessarily for the viewers to get the same story, but instead for them to use that story to access that deeper experience. And this is kind of a perfect explanation of the Neoplatonist view of simulacra. The picture, however subtly, has been altered so that it doesn't refer back to the real barn anymore, but instead the story of the barn. A story which, by the way, also isn't particularly true. The barn is less than 100 years old and became an iconic part of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, only after being abandoned by its original owners and turning into a roadside attraction. But in their paper, Allen and Hanley argue that this kind of thing is good, since by willingly stepping into a simulacrum, whether it's a work of art or nature, people are able to use that to experience a piece of the sublime. The people who travel to the barn aren't just taking pictures of taking pictures, they're taking pictures of this story. And a part of me really likes this reading, since I have a pretty firm policy that anytime someone has a profound experience with art or nature, I view it as a net good. But on the other hand, I'm not a huge fan of, letting someone lie because it makes people happy. It seems to me that those kinds of profound experiences are cheapened if we just make shit up so that people can have them. Like with the Mona Lisa, or actually, an even better example is the Venus de Milo. That sculpture is actually bullshit. So, during the early 1800s, the Louvre was in pretty rough shape. In 1815, France had started returning a bunch of the art Napoleon had stolen, which was easily 70% of what was in the Louvre. This led to a lot of empty wall space, and so the museum was down ridiculously bad for a new attraction. And the thing that they really wanted was a statue from the classical period, since classical sculptures were like the shit at the time in France. 100 Gex? More like 400 BCE. That's what everyone in France was like back then. Straight up, if you played Money Machine on some loudspeakers 200 years ago, it'd kill more people than the Reign of Terror. So in 1820, when a Greek farmer on the island of Milos found an ancient statue, the French were on that shit. They immediately called dibs, sent their experts over to excavate and reassemble the statue, and paid the farmer 1,000 francs, which is about 11,000 in today's money. Most of the sculpture was found in 2 large pieces, of course with both of its arms iconically missing. Once they'd finished putting it together, they were fucking stoked to have found this amazing sculpture. These experts claim that the masterpiece came from the classical period and was likely made by the famous Greek sculptor Praxiteles. The year after it was discovered, they proudly displayed it in their classical section, where it immediately drew enormous crowds, which continue to this day. The only issue is that the Louvre was lying. The statue's base showed that it wasn't from the classical period at all, but the Hellenistic period about 200 to 300 years later. The base also contained the signature of the real artist, who wasn't Praxiteles, but you fucking guessed it, Alexandros of fucking Atrioch, who is just another sculptor, but one who's much less famous. But yeah, because it was such a big draw and they wanted to keep it in the classical section, they fully just hid the base of the sculpture in the basement for over 100 years until they finally revealed the truth in the 50s. And the thing is that I definitely felt something seeing those pieces, but if I'm being completely honest, with the Mona Lisa, it was more a feeling of being fascinated by the whole spectacle, whereas with the Venus de Milo, my first thought was honestly, it's just like in the Simpsons episode. But there's another way of looking at all of this, one that's much more explicitly referenced in the passage from White Noise than Baudrillard, and that's an essay by Walter Benjamin called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. The essay deals with Benjamin's thoughts on the way that art has changed in the age of the photograph and the movie camera, an age where anything can be reproduced an infinite number of times. Benjamin talks about original art having a genuineness to it that he calls its aura. While I think that DeLillo using that term in White Noise is probably a reference to Benjamin's essay given the context, unlike Murray, when Benjamin uses the word aura, he's talking about something that, by definition, can't be photographed. The aura for Benjamin is the here and now-ness of the work, that realness that you feel when you're looking at something that you can reach out and touch. He thought that the aura is lost through the mechanical reproduction of art, not only when the genuine work of art is reproduced by, for instance, being photographed and reprinted, or now through digital scans, but also he talks about how he was now noticing the start of new kinds of art that were specifically designed to be infinitely reproduced. A perfect example of this is this video that you're currently watching. There is a massive difference between this and being in a room with someone explaining this to you in person. For one thing, that person would probably be smart, but also, I'm not talking to you, or anyone really. Right now, I'm sitting in my apartment filming myself reading a script off of a teleprompter, redoing each take over and over again until I get it right. I'll then go through everything in an editing program to cut it all together. There is no aura here because everything you're seeing has been meticulously mediated by a camera and editing designed to be experienced not by a single person, but by hundreds of thousands. That might be a bit optimistic for a video about the Mona Lisa, but we'll see. For Benjamin, what made reproduced art especially significant was that he was writing in 1935 when photography and movies were still fairly new mediums. And so when Benjamin talks about movies as works of art that are meant to be reproduced, he wasn't imagining YouTube videos that were written, performed, and edited by one person on a heroic dose of Vyvanse, but a whole crew where each individual artist's contribution was combined like workers on an assembly assembly line. This led to him having some wildly optimistic ideas about how movies were going to become this revolutionary proletarian medium, which hasn't worked out too well. But the reason he thought this is because something that I don't think is at all clear in the essay is that Benjamin thought that it was a good thing that the aura is disappearing. This is just a heads up that if anyone's interested in reading this essay, Benjamin was undeniably brilliant. Like, there are so many parts that completely blew my mind, but also he can be pretty hard to understand. You know, when someone's so smart that they almost sound dumb? I've watched so many YouTube videos explaining this essay, and they all say that the mistake people always make is not realizing that Benjamin was against the aura, which I think at that point it's on him. The evidence that they point to is always this one quote.
And that technological reproduction, in this kind of massification, in his words, emancipates the work of art from its parasitic subservience to ritual.
Which, by the way, Theory and Philosophy is a dope channel that all of you should subscribe to, but also, like, I'll be honest, I'm kind of just taking his word on this a bit here. So why doesn't Benjamin like the aura, and what does he mean when he says ritual here? Basically, he talks about two ways that people have valued art, through cult value and exhibition value. With the cult value, think about like a cross in a church. While people might want a fancy cross that looks nice, it's not there to be purely decorative, right? Like, when they were first decorating churches, no one said, you know what would make a great centerpiece? An ancient Roman execution method. No, instead the cross is there because it's a symbol that's seen to be doing something. An even better example would be a cave painting of an antelope as part of like a spiritual ceremony. In that case, how realistic the antelope looked was presumably beside the point. It wasn't important how good the art was, but just that it was there, since it was an ingredient in a ritual. Benjamin points out that the greater the cult value that a piece of art has, the more closed off it is from the public. This could be in the form of art or artifacts with religious significance, which can never be moved from a specific place or can only be viewed by people with a certain rank in the institution. It can also be the case where objects are closed off from the public because of the role that they play in a political or economic ritual, like being in a private collection or a cabinet of curiosities. The Mona Lisa was originally displayed in the palaces of King Francois I and Louis XIV, and then in Napoleon's bedchambers. Exhibition value, on the other hand, works in the opposite way. The more the work is reproduced and the more that it's shown, the greater the value. This is because it isn't an ingredient in a larger ritual anymore, but instead is a symbol with its own significance. Benjamin was glad to be done with the aura because he saw it as a holdover from when art wasn't available to the masses, but was instead hidden away by the rich and powerful to be used in their evil rituals. This doesn't mean that he thought everything was fine, though. Instead, he pointed out that even though art was now largely being viewed secularly, it was still being turned into a sort of sacred object in the form of art for art's sake. Benjamin called this view of art a sort of negative theology, in that it's the idea that art should be seen as pure, unaffected by any social or political conditions, and certainly not serving any social function or message. This is extremely clear in the case of the Mona Lisa, actually, in no small part because art for art's sake is exactly what Walter Pater believed in. And so, it's no wonder that the Mona Lisa is seen as this kind of holy relic when its most famous feature is its mysterious smile, literally an absence of meaning. Benjamin argued that instead of art for art's sake, the correct response was to politicize art. And so, I'm gonna try and do just that by going back to the Mona Lisa, but first, there's a lot more to this story there. Pater's over-the-top fan fiction did turn the Mona Lisa into the capital M masterpiece, but while it was undeniably famous in the art world, all that really meant for normies was that the painting got a prominent write-up in the Louvre's guidebook. For the Mona Lisa to become the icon it is today, the vampire had to disappear. This happened on August 21st, 1911, when the Mona Lisa was stolen. The man who stole it was an Italian guy named Vincenzo Perugia, and this dude was amazing. The son of a bricklayer, Perugia was born in Demenza, a village a bit north of Milan. In his 20s, he traveled around living in Milan, Lyon, and eventually settling on Paris when he was 25, where he worked in construction because, as you'll see, Perugia was the most Italian man to ever live. Before stealing the painting, he'd been in jail in Paris twice. Once for robbing a sex worker, and then a second time for literally bringing a gun to a knife fight. He would get into fights constantly, generally because he was very short and, as I said, very Italian. He once testified that he was bullied by all the French construction workers, saying that
they almost always called me Mangia Maccheroni, and very often they stole my personal property and salted my wine.
I cannot stress enough that that quote was from a grown man who was complaining about being bullied in court while on trial for stealing the Mona Lisa.
Anti-Italian discrimination.
But to be fair here, Vincenzo had a right to be a bit defensive. This guy taught himself how to read as an adult and apparently used to spend days holed up in libraries, cafes, or art galleries reading everything he could get his hands on. When he was on trial, the prosecution described him as a house painter, and so Perugia, furious, stood up and shouted that he was an artist. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's talk about the heist, because it rules. Like I said, while back then the Mona Lisa absolutely wasn't the icon it is today, it wasn't obscure either. In 1910, 1 year before Perugia's heist, the Louvre received a very weird letter from someone in Vienna threatening the Mona Lisa. Like, not to steal it, but I guess to destroy it or something. And so the Louvre had a glass box built to protect the painting. Now, when I say that Perugia was involved in this, the natural assumption is probably that he sent the letter threatening to whack the Mona Lisa because he suspected her of salting his wine. But instead, he was one of the laborers hired to build the glass box, and working on that job gave him some interesting ideas. And so, on Sunday, August 20th, 1911, Perugia, wearing one of the white artist smocks that the staff of the Louvre wore at the time, conveniently one of the easiest possible uniforms to forge, he posed as a worker and then snuck into a storage closet where he slept overnight. There's all sorts of debate as to whether or not he was alone. A lot of sources claim that he had accomplices, 2 Italian brothers he was friends with, who one source claims were plumbers, which is fucking awesome. Other people think that he and the brothers were all pawns of some secret criminal mastermind. I'm not going to go into the details because they aren't that interesting, and they don't change what I'm going to talk about, but I'm pretty convinced that he worked alone. Anyways, the Louvre was closed on August 21st, and since it was at the time the largest building in the world and also had hilariously lax security, after a night in a storage closet, Perugia found himself alone in the gallery and was able to take his time. He removed the Mona Lisa from the wall and took it out of its protective box, which he knew how to do since he had helped install it. Then, he hid the painting under his clothes, and this is completely true, walked out the front door without anyone noticing him like a fucking hitman speedrunner. It gets weirder too, because not only did no one notice him stealing the painting or walking away with it, they wouldn't have even noticed that it was gone at all if not for pure coincidence. Louis Barrault, an artist who was famous for reproducing paintings, just so happened to be scheduled to paint the Mona Lisa the morning after it had been stolen, but instead, he found 4 screws on the wall where the painting was supposed to be. Once they realized it was stolen, the Louvre closed for a week to investigate. France's borders were closed, a 25,000 franc reward was put out for the painting, and every train or ship in and out of Paris was being searched. All of this was unsuccessful though, because instead of fleeing the country, after Perugia had gotten out with the painting, he took a cab back to his apartment, hid the painting in a trunk he'd built with a false bottom, showed up to work late claiming he was just hungover, and then didn't open the trunk for 2 fucking years. A few things happened in those years though. For one thing, after being closed for a week, the Louvre reopened but kept the space where the Mona Lisa had hung empty. This became a massive attraction for the museum. People traveled from all over the world to see an empty space with 4 hooks. Another thing was that people were pretty understandably like, how the fuck did this happen? And so the Louvre investigated their security policies and realized that, oops, actually there were a bunch of works that had been stolen that they hadn't even noticed. I just love that the Louvre used to collect art like I collect graphic novels. Like, I either have a copy of Immortal Hulk 2 lying around somewhere here, or maybe I lent it to someone. In particular, a series of 3 Iberian sculptures were missing. To find them, the Louvre put out a reward which wound up being claimed by the man who stole them in the first place, a Belgian art thief named Joseph Guéret-Piré. When questioned, Piré told the Paris police that he'd been paid to bring them to the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, and that they were for Apollinaire's painter friend, better known as Pablo Picasso, who'd been using the sculptures as references for his paintings, and specifically one of his most famous works, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I've been preparing for this video by really going hard on Duolingo, and am fully aware that based off my pronunciation just now, Lily's gonna track me down and really make me bite the curb, if you know what I mean. But this part of the story is awesome. Picasso and Apollinaire were arrested, not for the sculptures, but for stealing the Mona Lisa, despite there being zero evidence. Apollinaire cracked immediately and confessed to everything, including stealing the Mona Lisa, which he absolutely didn't do, whereas Picasso instead denied everything, including having ever met Apollinaire, which he absolutely had. Apparently, the judge just decided to throw the case out, which, like, these guys had actually stolen things from the Louvre, but apparently you can get let off the hook by being a big enough dumbass in court. But the thing that's interesting to me here is that there was a certain logic to thinking that these two guys were in some way out to get the Mona Lisa. Picasso and Apollinaire were at the forefront of modernism, which at the time was a radical avant-garde movement. While this obviously didn't make any actual sense, there is a certain logic to the authorities having it in for the people advocating for a type of art that looked a lot like the 4 screws in a wall that had now replaced the Mona Lisa, the most iconic symbol of the old guard. It gets even better. The French art writer and friend of Picasso, André Salmon, had written at length about how much he hated the influence that Da Vinci had on art. Salmon specifically saw the Mona Lisa as an obstacle that needed to be overcome to free art. And the person he thought was doing this was Picasso, specifically thanks to, you guessed it, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. In one of his books, he writes,
"The Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world. It is also the most imitated. It has been copied by all the painters who have tried to reproduce nature with exactitude. But Picasso has broken with this tradition. He has rejected the imitation of nature and the expression of sentiment. He has painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a work that marks a turning point in the history of art. In Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Picasso has liberated himself from the tyranny of Leonardo. He has shown that there is another way of painting."
I feel like with friends like that, it's not really any wonder that Picasso denied having ever met Apollinaire. Like, the cops are just busting down his door because they take any writing like that very literally, and Pablo's just like... But as you can probably guess from that, the Paris police weren't doing a great job in their investigation, since, you know, if they were smart, they wouldn't be cops. At one point, they even questioned Perugia along with all the other workers who'd installed the glass box, which they only did as a last resort after everything else had failed. I just love how these cops are just like, damn it, think! Okay, we've raided the houses of every avant-garde artist in Paris, from Man Ray to Marcel Duchamp. We gotta get outside the box here. One guy is just like, this is probably stupid, but like, what if we maybe tried interviewing people who'd had direct access to the painting and the scene of the crime? So yeah, they did like fully search Perugia's apartment where the Mona Lisa was and just didn't find anything. One other thing they did right after the painting was announced missing, though, was plaster Paris with wanted posters for the Mona Lisa, which didn't help them find the painting at all, but is very interesting for our purposes, since I would argue that this is what caused the Mona Lisa to reach the level of fame it now has. Almost overnight, the painting itself became literally impossible to see by anyone, while simultaneously reproductions of the painting became impossible to avoid. To put this in terms of Walter Benjamin's theories, this basically maximized both the Mona Lisa's cult value and its exhibition value at the same time. One of my favorite anecdotes about this is that in those 2 years when the Mona Lisa became wildly famous, it was common for people to sell prints of it. And this is going to sound crazy, but the prints weren't even of her made into a minion or smoking a joint or anything. The thing is that at this time, not only was photography nowhere near as accurate as it is today, but even if it was, the primary way of replicating pictures was lithography, which was even less accurate. And so the way that people would make prints would be by photographing sketches of the painting. And so it's not too surprising that once the Mona Lisa was eventually found and returned, it became a sort of simulacrum as well. But before we get into that too much, let's talk about how the painting was recovered. After 2 years, Perugia decided it was finally time for him to get rid of the painting, so he threw all of his stuff in that false-bottom trunk and traveled back to Italy. Once he was there, he got a hotel and called up an Italian art dealer asking if he'd be interested in buying the Mona Lisa. Except, this wasn't someone who trafficked in stolen art, or even just a guy he knew. He literally just found him in the phone book, gave him a call, and then invited him over to his hotel to see the painting, because everything that this man does is insane. So after spending a while talking to Perugia, the art dealer is convinced enough to meet with him, goes to the hotel, sees the painting, and is basically like, yeah, let me come up with a number and I'll get back to you. And then immediately calls the police. Perugia is arrested and extradited to France, where he was found guilty because the judge wasn't very receptive to his defense of, "But Your Honor, they bullied me." The thing is, I'm only kind of joking there. There genuinely was a lot of
anti-Italian discrimination
in France at the time, and it is very believable that Perugia faced a lot of it while he was working construction. His version of the story is that while he was working at the Louvre, his boss had brought up how much of the art there was from Italy, essentially to rub Perugia's nose in the fact that France had looted his country and was never going to give back what they'd stolen. And as much as I like to clown on Italians here, that is genuinely an incredibly fucked up thing to brag about. This, Perugia claimed, put him into a patriotic rage, and so he decided to get even by liberating the Mona Lisa, returning her to her homeland where she belonged. Although, funnily, and far be it from me to let details get in the way of a good revenge story, the Mona Lisa was actually probably the only painting in the entire room it was in that actually wasn't stolen from Italy, but had been bought legally. Not one to get hung up on details though, Perugia claimed that he was never interested in money, which was a lie. He wrote tons of letters to his friends and family back home about how he was about to get rich. That said, it is still pretty likely that the story about his boss was true, and so I think that when he claimed that he just wanted revenge against his asshole boss and to fuck over France, both of which are incredibly based reasons to commit a crime, there's a good chance that he was at least partly telling the truth, and it made him a bit of a hometown anti-hero. The painting did a tour through Italy before being sent back to France, and Perugia was sentenced to 1 year in prison, although he was released after serving only 7 months. He fought in World War I and had a family in France where he lived for the rest of his life until he died on his 44th birthday. Now, while this is just amazing no matter what, I want to get back to what this video is all about. This pretty lady. That was weird. I shouldn't have done it like that. So something that's important to touch on is how the context that a work of art is displayed in affects the art itself. One good example would be to compare the Louvre to another museum, the Getty in Los Angeles. Both museums feature a wide variety of famous old European art, to the point where if you switch two paintings from one museum to the other, it's unlikely that anyone would notice, but the context that they'd be displayed in would drastically change the art. The Louvre is an ancient museum that was originally a palace built in the 12th century by King Philip II and gradually became the royal residence until Louis XIV moved to Versailles in 1682, leaving the Louvre to become a place for displaying the royal art collection. After the Revolution, the collection was declared public property, and the Louvre was turned into a public museum, which then grew much more under Napoleon, whose signature move was to steal all the art from any place he invaded, which was a lot. The Getty, on the other hand, is much more modern. It was started by the American businessman and art collector J. Paul Getty in 1954, with the Getty Center later being built in 1997 to display a vast collection of pre-20th century paintings as well as modern photography. Unlike the Louvre, the Getty is a very modern building in a modern city. It's also completely inaccessible by foot and requires you to either drive or take a train there. I don't bring this up just to shit on LA's lack of walkability, but to point out that the context in which art is displayed is an integral part of the experience of art. Something that I think is worth noting about the change that took place when the Louvre and the collection inside of it went from being the property of the king to that of the state is what didn't change. Something that's worth noting about a monarchy is that in one, the royal's job is in a sense to act as the personification of the country. The art historian Roy Strong has noted, for instance, that the reason why a monarch will have so much treasure isn't so much just because they necessarily want it, but because it's part of their job in a sense. This isn't meant as a defense of royals or anything. Imagine if this was just me coming out as a monarchist. As Strong notes,
magnificence was an element of fundamental importance to the Renaissance and Baroque court. A prince must be seen to live magnificently, to dress splendidly, to furnish his palaces. Its fundamental objective was power conceived as art.
Essentially, the art was kind of beside the point. The reason it was there was because it represented a display of power to have been able to gather it all. And so, in the case of the Louvre becoming publicly owned, while the ownership of the art and the building have changed, many have criticized just the concept of museums themselves by pointing out that not that much else is different from when these were private collections. My friend Maya Ben-David made a fantastic video where she discusses cabinets of curiosities and rooms of wonders, private collections of art, treasures, and indigenous artifacts that have been plundered through colonialism. These were extremely popular among the rich in Europe, particularly in England. In her video, Maya argues that video game inventories are modern-day descendants of that practice, and it feels almost redundant to say that the same is absolutely true of museums. Not only are the collections in most elite museums in Western countries still made up of objects that were collected through colonial plunder, but their existence still serves the same function, which is to display power. The only difference now is that instead of the collection belonging to the royalty who served as a personification of the country under a monarchy, under a democracy, it's open to the public, since the public now fills that role instead. So finally, let's get into why exactly people go to the Louvre to take pictures of taking pictures. I think my favorite take on this is one that I found in a book called Stealing the Mona Lisa by Darian Leder. At one point in it, he addresses the cliche of how people will say, "My kid could do that," in response to modernist art. There have been plenty of responses to this question before me, but his answer was one that I hadn't heard before, which was that if a kid's art winds up in a museum, then maybe that itself makes it belong there. He writes,
Whether one chooses to interpret such remarks as a sign of ignorance or of understanding, they overlook the significance of the relation between a work and the place in which the work finds itself. There might be no such thing as a boy painter, but if a boy's painting finds itself in the right place at the right time, can we deny so swiftly that it is a painting?
I can see how this may seem like a cop-out, and it does definitely avoid the question of what does or doesn't belong in a museum in the first place, but his point is more about the way that the context that art is presented in changes it. An 8-year-old's picture being hung in a museum would cause people to look at it and experience it very differently than if it was on a refrigerator. In the same way that a painting being hung in the Louvre might represent the history of European painting and the French Empire, whereas if the same painting was hung in the Getty, it'd be more of a testament to the business success of J. Paul Getty and the prosperity of America and California. When it comes to the Mona Lisa, I think that the best way to describe the experience I had, as well as that of the angry reviewers, is that we were seeing a sort of performance art piece being performed by the museum and the people taking those pictures. Thanks for watching.